Hi, I'm Katie Barker. Let's talk about this soil. It is located in Larimer County, Colorado, near the Poudre River, which is highlighted in orange there within the green box, and beside the Poudre Learning Center and Aggregate Industries concrete yard. The climate is a temperate climate with a mesic temperature regime and ustic precipitation. The topography is pretty level here, and the parent material is primarily alluvium deposited by the stream or a little bit of wind loss as well. So this pit is a little over 100 centimeters deep. And as you can kind of see here, it is in a grassland floodplain. So there's actually, the river is just about 100 yards that way. And here you can see there's a lot of organic material in the top here. And then if I dig into this spot right here, just under, there's some red in there. That's a redoxamorphic feature, so modeling, which means basically that there's some iron in here that is getting oxidized. And then just under that, you can see all this white. This white accumulation is calcium, and the calcium in this soil comes in two forms. It is a calcium carbonate and also gypsum. Let me see if I can get you a chunk here to look at. So you might be able to see there's some ribbons of white in this dark soil. And those are gypsum. So moving downward, you have this really dark layer. Really dark material there. And then it changes again. And you have this pretty loose, friable, but subangular blocky structure down into here. And then down in this very bottom layer, it's really, really friable. I'd call that massive structure. So that all kind of walks us through actually where our horizons are. So this top bit, this is part of the A horizon. And then I'd separate this out here into maybe a second A or an AB horizon with the redoxamorphic features in there, the iron. And then we get into our B horizons, and that's because this has an accumulation now of also some clay and nutrients, the calcium and all. And something else I want to point out about this first B horizon is the structure. The structure is pretty prismatic, and it doesn't break apart as easily, even when wet, as the others. It does break apart, but it's nothing like this below that just breaks all apart. So, and then in this kind of center area, this I'd still call subangular blocky, but it's got a little bit of like a platey type feel to it. And that's just an interesting feature of the way the soil has aggregated. And again, we do have some gypsum in there. Now, the reason the structure matters with the soil is that it changes the way water moves through the soil, and also the way that gases and nutrients move through the soil. We don't have a gray colored soil. We do have some red iron in here. But overall, looking at this color of this soil, I don't have a color book here to compare for you, but what you can see immediately is that this soil is not super yellow and it's not super red. It's somewhere in between. And then it's also pretty dark in color when you wet it compared to a lot of other soils. And what that tells us is that there's a lot of more organic material in there. So I put these into a little chart here to show you that there are 6 horizons, and they vary a little bit in their texture and structure as they go down. And as well, while they have the same general color, the 10YR, they do change a little bit in their hue and value. This area, the A horizon and into here, probably down to here, might be enough organic matter to consider this entire chunk a molic epipedon. Now, that's a really technical term, but what that tells us is that we have a very fertile soil. And it helps us to classify the taxonomy of the soil, which is a great way for us to have kind of a short form of information about a soil and a way that we can compare different soils by using their names. So having a molic epipedon leads us to describe this as a mollisol. And in addition to that, because we have these aquic conditions, we would also call it an aqual, and that is the suborder of the soil. And then finally, for the great group, we'll add in a little bit more information about what we just saw in the horizons. In this case, I would choose to highlight the accumulation of calcium carbonate and gypsum a little bit, but I think mostly the calcium carbonate. And that means that it'll be classified as a calciaqual. That seems to match with the definitions given by the USDA NRCS book Illustrated Guide to Soil Taxonomy, which describes how these soils exist in floodplains around rivers in the semi-arid West, and capillary rise of calcium-rich water and subsequent evapotranspiration is important for the genesis of the soils and creating this calcium-rich aqual. Yeah, so that about covers what I want to talk to you about in this pit. How about now we go to a slideshow and I'll show you what that means for what you can and can't do with this soil. Yet before I get into the uses of the soil, I do want to point out some of these things that were discovered about the soil through NRCS. And one is that there's around 2% organic matter throughout the profile. And that's not super high, but it is higher than most of the local soils. It has a pH of 7.9, which is a little bit basic and supports there being a lot of calcium in the soil. Likewise, the cation exchange capacity of 14.5 does allow the soil to hold on to some of those calcium carbonates and minerals. And the bulk density in the top almost half of the pit is just about typical at 1.28 grams per cubic centimeter, but then it condenses, gets a little compacted in the lower part of the soil. So you have a lot less movement of water and nutrients and such in the lower part. We also did touch upon the water properties a little bit already, but it's important to point out that this was found to be hydric group D, which means that it has a very slow infiltration rate, low rate of water transmission, and low surface runoff, and a lot of frequent but brief flooding, and also a high water table in the spring and summer. Which leads us to the suitability for basically anything you'd like to do with this soil. Unfortunately, because of the flooding, there's not a lot you can do with it. It is very limited for building a dwelling, either with or without a basement. And it's also limited for landscaping because of flooding, and also for building roads or a septic or sewage lagoon. The main reason is the flooding, but there's also the depth to the water saturated zone, which is rather shallow, as I pointed out in the last slide, during the summer months. And also, this site apparently gets pretty dusty and it can have some frost action, which impacts the site suitability. So maybe you don't want to live there, but how is it for recreation? Well, unfortunately, we have the same limitations for various recreational uses, such as camping, picnicking, and even making a trail through the area. We're going to run into the flooding, the dust, and the depth to the water zone. As well, even the water related uses, basically building a pond, you have issues with seepage here and also unstable excavation walls if you were to excavate out a pond area. It's even limited for cultivation, for agriculture, unfortunately. While this soil is actually very fertile, it cannot support life very well or cultivation very well with the wetness that it has. So, in order to be farmland, you would have to drain it and protect it from flooding. So, in conclusion, unfortunately, we can't use this site for very many things right now, but it's a beautiful area, so it's best to protect it and preserve it as is. So, thank you for watching, and I hope that you found this insightful.